who are using the book, there is a learning curve to it. And we missed it in the beginning, but we caught up with it later. So the book journeys, so it starts with Ash Wednesday, which was Eve, and then it journeys through to week 1. But the way you read it, we decided to go with the book. So I introduce it and then you go into it versus you didn't read it all week and think what you think, and then you come here and it's like, well, that ain't what I said. But so today we'll talk about Hagar, and then all week you shall read about Hagar. And there were some worship materials that came with it. And so every week we're going to send out an email. I'm going to send it to Miss Brenda, then Miss Brenda going to send it, with a little blessing with the artwork for that week from the person. So last week was the blessing of Eve. I'll slip that in. And then this week is the blessing of Hagar. And each week there is a blessing based on whatever the theme of the book is. There's also, like Ms. Kristen said, I thought I saw it up here, but I don't. The coloring page has artwork. It's for grown-ups or for our youth alike. If you would like those, we can send those out too. But it's just so many little rich things that you get to do. On Ash Wednesday, we had the prayer labyrinth, the finger labyrinth out there. And I love walking a labyrinth. We have one in Wichita I always call it the nunnery, but that is not what it is. Maybe it's I like nunnery, but it's where the nuns live. And so there's a prayer labyrinth outside. But here's a nice, for these 30-degree days, a little finger labyrinth where you can have centering prayer or contemplative prayer and kind of walk yourself through that. It really does work. I be testing stuff out. So I tried it with the Lord's Prayer last week. And I was like, I know it. I can say it all the time. But actually saying it while doing your finger, it slows you down. It just makes it more mindful. And I was like, oh, yeah, forgive me my trespasses. That's right. And it just felt really good. So I welcome you to grab a prayer labyrinth as well. Miles set a high bar for my wisdom today, so I pray that God give me liberty, because I probably had more questions than answers after I dug through this. I'm like, there's so much here. So good luck to all of you and Godspeed. So this story starts for me, this sermon starts for me July of 2023 during my candidating weekend here. One of the questions that I got asked was, why in my bios on the interwebs do I call myself a child of Hagar? And I was glad that people actually asked me about it. Number one, it showed me you did your due diligence. You had looked me up. You Googled me. But number two, I know that Hagar, first of all, she didn't even make it into the title of any of the songs we sang. She got the verse, but I feel like with all her impact, she could have been a named she couldn't get royalties or nothing, but she could have been a named person. But when people talk about their biblical heroes or the people they admire, I don't really it's like when people say who are your top 5 rappers or what are your top 5 movies. I don't hear people say Hagar in their top 5. And so I feel like I got to make up for that repeatedly. But to me, claiming Hagar means belonging to a story, to a lineage, and to an identity that's overlooked. The reason I say her name is partly because as an African-American descendant of slavery, I resonate with Hagar's ancestrally. To be taken from your home against your will, made to labor in a variety of ways without compensation, and let me stress variety of ways, and treated as chattel or a personal possession is encoded in my DNA. Though there are some who want to rewrite that history, my body keeps that score. The other reason is something I reflected on while reading Prone to Wander. Joanna writes about Hagar choosing the wilderness, and I thought about how I had to choose it multiple times too. As a young person and a young adult, I grew up in a very abusive, toxic home. I had to make a choice too. Stay with what was familiar, even though it hurt, and even though I may not have lived through it, or step into the unknown. I chose the unknown. It was not an easy choice, but it was a necessary one, a choice that led me here to people I love and adore. Growing up, I did not or was not empowered with the ability to choose. Hagar also did not get to choose much in her life. She was enslaved, given to Abraham by Sarah without consent, which is baffling. It's like human trafficking 101 here. She was then used to bear a child and then mistreated when she fulfilled the role that was imposed upon her. She had no say in what happened to her body, to her future, or her survival. And when Sarah dealt harshly with her, she fled. And I feel like the Bible picks and chooses when it's graphic or not. And so it's interesting to me that oftentimes when it's violence against women, it's really, and then it was just cast out, thrown around, serpents, whatever. That serpent part had me roll. I was like, man, snake's been acting up for a long time, even in children's stories. So thank you, Audrey. But dealt harshly, I could imagine what that actually meant. And we fly over it. And not because we don't care, but because the text just says, Sarah dealt harshly with her. But if you can think of times in our history where we have dealt harshly with people, and by we, I don't mean me, but I'll just keep on with the royal we, but how we deal harshly and what that actually entails, whether we're talking concentration camps, internment camps, plantations, like our history is steeped with dealt harshly. But she ran into the wilderness. I often wonder why this moment isn't more central in the conversation on freedom. We lift up Exodus as the defining story of fleeing tyranny and oppression, perhaps because it centers Moses and the patriarchal narrative. But here too is a story of liberation, one that begins with a woman on the run, choosing the unknown instead of continued suffering. The wilderness can be a complicated place. Some of you may hear the word and it's like, oh my God, we are not journeying through this dark wood again. And it may bring up feelings of hopelessness or despair. I think about times in my own life when I felt like I was in that wilderness. Maybe you have those moments too. Maybe there are moments where you feel exiled, removed from comfort, lacking clarity. And yet when we look at the scripture, we see that the wilderness is not just a place of suffering, but a place of transformation. Biblically, the wilderness is where people meet God in profound ways, where they wake, where they wrestle, where they shed what no longer serves them, where something new begins to take shape. It's a place where the old you and the oldness and the old behaviors can be stripped away and something new forged. Sometimes we need the wilderness. Sometimes we need to step away from what's familiar to hear God's voice more clearly. For Hagar, the wilderness was not just an escape, it was an encounter, an experience. Imagine what it must have felt like living on, the compound. I don't know what they lived on, but living on the Sarah Abraham Jones's compound. I don't know. People in the Bible don't have last names. It's kind of crazy. But imagine what that had to be like. Imagine what it was like to be unseen, disregarded, unknown. To know that survival was uncertain, but to stay would erase you. There was power in the choice that she made. Even when it seemed every decision had been taken away from her, there were still ways she got to claim something for herself. Hagar ran, but she did not run alone. In the wilderness, she met God. And as he called upon her, she was able to name him. Naming is a powerful act. In Genesis, Adam was given the responsibility of naming the animals, defining them, shaping their existence through the words he assigned. But in all of Scripture, Hagar is the only person regarded as naming God. That makes me proud. She calls God El Roi, the God who sees. That moment is more than a theological reflection or memory to pull upon. In a world that refused to see her, God did. When those around her treated her body as an incubator and treated her as less than human, God called her by her name. There is something deeply significant about being seen, about being recognized for who you are and not just what you produce. Being named is an affirmation of identity, a way of saying you matter, I see you, I know you. We see this in the trans and gender expansive and non-binary community. The ability to name oneself, to claim a name that resonates and affirms, is an act of self-determination. It's an assertion of existence, pushing against categories that other people try to impose. Many of us know how it feels to be misnamed, mislabeled, called out of our names, to have our identity shaped by the assumptions of others. Think about what it feels like when someone refuses to acknowledge who you are, when they dismiss you, erase you, call you by a thing that doesn't fit. Now think about how it feels when someone truly recognizes you and calls your name with intention and care and respect. Hagar's act of naming God reminds us that there is someone who sees us fully. And if God sees us, then the only next question to ask is, how do we see ourselves and others? How we treat the nameless tells us a lot about how we treat the world. It's easy to dismiss something that has no name, to reduce people to categories rather than seeing them as whole beings. We see it in the way that people treat the unhoused. We see it in the way society turns immigrants into statistics and numbers and criminals. We see it in the way that the incarcerated are treated. We see it in how whole communities of richness and diversity are flattened into stereotypes. Hagar had a name, but in Sarah's household, she was a slave to be done with what would. Stripped of agency, reduced to utility, defined only by what she could provide. And then when she provided it, still in trouble. This idea and this reduction of identity is not just some ancient Galilean practice. It happens now. The distinction between who is valued and who is marginalized is written in the language we use, in the stories we allow to be told, and in the hierarchies we uphold. The way we name and categorize others determine whether they're seen with dignity or reduced to something less. We see this in Galatians. Paul, in Galatians 4, draws a sharp contrast between Hagar and Sarah, casting one as the mother of slavery and the other as the mother of promise. Some interpret this as some metaphorical discussion and distinction between the law and grace, bondage and freedom. Others argue that Paul's framing reflects his theological agenda and not the full reality of Hagar's story. Now, while Paul uses Hagar and Sarah as these two contrasting figures, the actual biblical narrative affirms that Hagar was seen by God and given a promise. She got covenant too. Rather than being cast aside, she was met with divine care, a reality that challenges the text in Galatians. Paul uses this story to make his theological and political argument. And in doing so, he creates a division that does not honor Hagar. Yes, Sarah was the mother of Isaac, the child of the covenant. But God did not abandon her or her wild ass of a son, Ishmael. She nor he was forgotten. She nor he was thrown away. But the way Paul frames the story has shaped centuries of Christian thought, reducing Hagar to something less. It's easy to divide people into categories: good, bad, valuable, not valuable, to determine who belongs and who does not. But God does not function that way. God's promises are not limited, and neither should our idea of who is included be. Too often the church has mirrored that division, elevating certain while marginalizing others. But God saw Hagar. He heard her and made a covenant with her. But alas, Paul's framing of Hagar was not the final word, because before Paul could write about her, Hagar spoke for herself, and in doing so, named the one with many names. Hagar's story is one that forces us to ask difficult questions about power, privilege, and who gets to tell our story. In Hamilton, okay, you knew I was going to do it. In Hamilton, there's a song, you see. I was listening to it this morning, and it says, "Who lives, who dies, who tells our stories?" The important part is that we do. Hagar's story is woven into the fabric of oppression and liberation. Her story is one of deep intimacy of a God who does not forget the ones people have cast aside. And just as Hagar named God in her moment of encounter, you are invited to consider what it means to name the divine in your own life. This passage has raised many questions for me. And so, like a good pastor, I just give them to you. What name do you call God? What resonates with you? Has God been a refuge in a time of fear, a provider when resources ran low, a source of healing when you were broken? The names we give to God are shaped by our experience, just as Hagar's was. What does your life say in the name you have for God? Is it El Shaddai, the all-sufficient or many-breasted one? Is it El Shalom, the God of peace? Maybe it's Jehovah Jireh, the God who provides, Jehovah Sikkenu, God of our righteousness, El Elyon, Most High God. Once you get a hold and get a grasp and a taste for what you call God, I want you then to look at, what are you calling yourself? What names have been placed on you that you don't deserve? Have you been called unworthy? Have you been named by your past mistakes rather than your future possibilities? What do you need to rename in your life? I remember a time I struggled with what to call myself. My head was so full of what other people said about me that I lost sight of who I was and my worth. There were labels rooted in shame and failures and not being enough. I carried those names like heavy stones, each one weighing down the truth of who I was. But then, in the sacred wilderness, I listened for God. I realized I had permission to call myself something different too. I could take on a new name, one rooted in grace, one rooted in love, and in the deep knowing that I serve a God who sees. And when they see, they know. And when they know, they love. And when they love, they care. And when they care, I am made new. Perhaps you carry a name that's burdening you too. Perhaps the world has told you you are not enough, that you're too much, that you do not belong. Today, walk with Hagar through the wilderness. Find God in the places where you feel lost, unseen, and forgotten, knowing that her presence is near. She is calling us by name. We serve a God who calls you and speaks to your belovedness, not your brokenness. What name is Elroy whispering over you today? What is God saying when they look out at you? May you have the courage to claim those names as your own. May you walk forward with boldness, wearing it like your favorite sweater, knowing that wherever the journey goes, you do not go alone. May you find peace, may you find favor, and knowing that as we have named God, God has so named us, and he calls us good. May it be so. Amen.